I was the last one to leave my sister's house the day we finished sorting her things. The others had already driven off with boxes and casseroles and leftover flowers, those pale hydrangeas Doris loved that always sagged as if they were tired of being beautiful. I stayed behind to sweep the hallway because I needed a quiet task that didn't require anyone's approval. When you've been a school principal for 32 years, sweeping alone feels like a promotion. Doris kept her sewing machine in the back bedroom. She'd fixed hems and Halloween costumes and prom dresses for half our town. The room still smelled like thread and lavender. The late afternoon light slanted across the hardwood floor in those dusty, forgiving stripes of Vermont autumn. And that's when I noticed a tiny dark line in one of the boards near the window. I pushed my broom bristles into it and felt them snag. The board moved. Not much. Just enough to tell me that time wasn't the only thing loosening in that house. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. There was no secret panel or moaning hinge. The board just lifted under my fingers like it had been waiting for me, the way a letter waits when you've postponed opening it, but somehow it knows your name. Underneath lay a folded envelope wrapped in wax paper and tied with blue thread. The envelope was addressed in Doris's careful hand. For Evan, she'd written, to be opened by his mother if I do not deliver it myself. My breath held itself in place. Evan is my son. He's 35, with the kind of face that makes cashiers tell him to have a blessed day. He'd done all the heavy lifting that week, physically with furniture and emotionally with me. And now he was off at the courthouse filing a form to close the estate he never wanted. He's newly married. He has a small landscaping business with a battered pickup and a neat column of clients who leave him thank you pies in July. He ought to be the sort of man no letter can unsettle. I turned the envelope over in my hands. The flap wasn't sealed. It looked like it had been opened and closed many times, as if Doris kept checking that it still said what she meant. The wax paper had protected it from dust and decades. I undid the blue thread and took a seat on the edge of the sewing table chair because sitting felt like permission. I didn't call Evan. I didn't call anyone. I slid the letter out and unfolded it, and my sister's voice, neat and direct on that lined paper, came into the room. Evan, my sweetest boy, she wrote at the top, as if she'd always called him that aloud when in truth she'd favored kiddo. If you're reading this, I didn't manage to put it in your hands myself. I'm sorry. I'm old enough to know better than to leave messes behind, but here we are. I smiled despite myself. Doris had a way of apologizing like a school announcement. The mess acknowledged, the hallway swept. I need to tell you 2 things, the letter went on. First, the orchard is yours by right. Margaret will know what I mean. Second, do not sign anything put before you concerning the house or any of my accounts until the matter of CB is settled. CB did not act alone. I believe someone is pressing to move paperwork quickly after I am gone, and that person wears a green scarf. There is a key in the kitchen piano bench. Take it to Bank of Maplebridge, Box 31. Bring your mother with you. Green scarf? I heard myself say out loud to the empty room, as if the walls kept a closet of suspects. A person in a green scarf? I read the letter twice more, because repetition is how I survive shock. It was dated 9 months earlier. It mentioned no names except a pair of initials and the bank. It talked about the orchard like a promise I'd forgotten to make. I stood very still and held the paper in 2 hands, the way I used to hold morning announcements in the school foyer, except there was no student here to send to the nurse and no bus, late from West Road, and no reason for my hands to tremble. But they trembled anyway. Clara sometimes wore a green scarf. She's Evan's wife. She's a real estate agent. The first day he brought her to my house for dinner, she'd looped a forest green scarf around her neck and pushed a casserole across my table like she was offering me half her life. She has a polite voice and steady eyes. She doesn't fidget. She never tells a story she can't finish. She calls me Margaret, not Mom, which I expected and somehow appreciate. From the day I met her, I said the same thing to myself that I say at the dentist. It's fine. It'll all be fine. Of course, lots of people wear green scarves in Vermont. People wear green everything here. It's a color we consider a birthright. It could have been somebody at the bank. It could have been anybody. The piano bench key. Doris had a beadboard piano bench that didn't match her piano. She'd told me once she liked the bench because it squeaked when you lifted it, proof it had secrets that songs didn't cover. I went to the living room and sat on that old squeak, the same way, strangely enough, I'd sat in it as a girl who couldn't quite master Für Elise. I lifted the lid. There were the usual things. Sheet music with tiny penciled notes, a metronome that always felt like a tiny boss, a Ziploc bag with a G clef charm. And there, taped neatly to the underside of the lid, was a small brass key wrapped in wax paper. I wish I could tell you that I swallowed, put the key in my purse, locked up the house, and waited for Evan to return so we could go to the bank together like Doris had instructed. I wish I were the variety of person who obeys even the dead. Sometimes I am. But the house was quiet, and the sky outside was folding itself into evening, and I thought about CB and the green scarf and do not sign anything. And I did what I have done since I was old enough to walk myself to school. I made a plan without an audience. I locked up Doris's house. I drove the 12 minutes to downtown Maplebridge, to Bank of Maplebridge, which is older than most marriages and dignified in the way a bank can pretend to be when what it is mostly holds our anxieties behind a brass counter. The lobby was still open for another 18 minutes. I walked in like somebody who belongs, because belonging is 90% posture. The teller recognized me. Everyone in that building recognizes me. You spend half your life with a principal's haircut and the other half with a principal's thanks you notes, and people consider you furniture. The teller, a slim woman named Lila who used to play trumpet in the marching band, smiled with that careful sympathy we reserve for the bereaved. "I'm sorry about Doris," she said. Her voice softened, like it had taken off its shoes. "What can we do for you?" "I need to access a safe deposit box," I said, as if I were not currently disobeying a careful request to bring my son with me. "Box 31, I have the key." Lila glanced around the way tellers do, as if the vault door itself had ears. "Of course," she said, and she led me through the swinging half doors to the back hallway where the air smells like copier toner and carpet glue. She checked my ID. She asked me to sign the ledger. She took the key. She used a second bank key with mine and drew out a metal drawer from the wall. "Take your time," she said, and she closed the little private viewing booth door behind me. The box held a thin folder and a flash drive in a zip bag, and a folded square of newspaper that crackled like humiliation. I sat at the table, the plastic chair quiet under me, and spread it all out. The folder contained photocopies, a deed to Doris's house, a 1987 document called Hale Orchard Trust, with my father's looping signature preserved like a leftover, a list of bank transactions from the past year with multiple checks written to Bishop Group Properties, a letter from a hospice social worker requesting a financial counselor visit, and a one-page rider with a signature that looked almost like my sister's, but wrong in a way only a sibling would notice. The rider authorized consultation fees in percentage amounts I didn't like seeing near my sister's name. The flash drive had a label in Doris's handwriting, recordings. The newspaper square was a clipped advertisement. "Need a fast sale? Bishop Group closes in days, Bishop." Clara's last name before she changed it was Bishop. When she married Evan, she hyphenated on her business cards for a while. Clara Bishop Hale, until she decided she preferred simplicity and trimmed it back to Clara Hale, at least for friends and family. Her real estate sign still said Bishop Group, because that's the company. It's her former broker's company, though she'd told us she'd left that firm several months ago to go independent. She said it as lightly as someone switching shampoos. It could be nothing. It could be everything. I pressed my palms flat on the level of the table to keep them from shaking. I considered, so quickly that it felt like instinct more than thought, driving straight to Evan's house, plunking the folder down between his hands and mine and saying, "We need to talk." But the letter had that warning, the way Doris had always warned me about second helpings and bad bargains. Do not sign anything. Someone wears a green scarf. CB is not alone. Bring your mother. I took out my phone and sent my son a simple text. "Still tidying at Aunt Dee's. Don't wait on me for dinner. He wrote back a heart and a thumbs up and, "You sure?" And I wrote yes, because sometimes the truth takes practice. I signed the ledger, I returned the box, I walked out of that bank with my heart thudding so hard that the guard nodded at me like he'd heard it. I drove home with the flash drive and the folder in my tote bag perched on the passenger seat like a passenger who didn't believe in seatbelts. When you've been a school principal, you develop a tone you use with yourself in an emergency. It's calm and disappointing. I used that tone to tell myself what to do. I would make tea. I would listen to whatever recordings Doris had collected. I would list facts, not feelings. I would not assume guilt based on initials, scarves, or advertisements. I would not call my son until I could stand in the doorway of his kitchen and speak without shaking. I would stop picturing Clara in a forest green scarf. At home, I slid the flash drive into my laptop as if it were a bomb I'd promised to defuse. There were 5 audio files, labeled by date, recorded on Doris's phone. The earliest was from 11 months ago. I clicked. My sister's voice came through in that half-whisper people adopt when they don't want to admit they're afraid. "It's been 2 weeks since the social worker sent the consultant," she said. "He introduced himself as Charles Benton from Bishop Group. CB, he kept calling me dear and touching the corner of the table like he owned it. He said the house is too big for me. He said there are smart ways to get cash without moving. He said he'd streamline things. He brought a woman with him who never said her name. She wore a green scarf. They set a folder on my kitchen table like it was a pie. I didn't sign anything. My hands shook and I said I needed my sister. He smiled and said, "No need to bother family." "I bothered you anyway today when you came by with apple bread." I couldn't say it aloud, but I'm saying it here. I paused the file and pressed my lips together until they felt like they might bruise. The second file recorded a phone call. Doris had always set phones on speaker because she didn't like holding things to her ear, so I could hear both sides. "Ms. Hale," a man's voice said, cheerful in the way the cheeriest voices sometimes belong to the worst people. "We're following up about that equity conversation. We can help you avoid probate and taxes if you create a trust with us as a manager. It's seamless. All we need is your signature on the rider, and we'll take care of every detail. You don't want to leave your sister a tangle, do you?" "I don't want to leave anyone anything that isn't clean," Doris said, slow the way she got when words mattered. "I'll get my own lawyer." "No need," he said again. "We do this all the time." The third file was a conversation with a woman, younger, crisp. "We need you to sign today," the woman said. "My client has buyers ready to move. You'll be able to stay until you're ready to move on. We can make exceptions. We're friends in this." "What is your name?" Doris asked. "Clara," she said, after a beat that felt like calculation. "Clara Bishop." I pulled my finger from the trackpad as if I'd been burned. I stood. I walked to the kitchen sink and ran water and leaned the heel of my hand against the counter. It could be coincidence, I told myself. Clara could have left the firm months ago, as she said. This recording could be older than I want to believe. She could have worked for them a year ago and now be free and clear. Or she could be tangled across the entire map of the problem. The fourth recording was just Doris talking to herself. If anything happens to me that doesn't look like weather, tell Margaret to look under the floorboard in the sewing room. Tell Evan the orchard is his. The orchard is not a metaphor. The orchard is land. The deed is in the trust. Father would be ashamed of me if I let anyone fast talk me out of it. Don't let them use big words and small kindnesses to make you polite. The fifth recording wasn't Doris's voice. It sounded like a voicemail. "Ms. Hale, it's Joel Ramsey from next door," the man said. Joel lives 2 houses down from Doris's place. He's in his 40s, wears flannel like revolutions wear banners, and he'd fixed Doris's snowblower twice last winter when she couldn't coax it awake. "I saw a dark SUV stop in front of your place just now. 2 people, one with a green scarf. I walked over and they drove off, just making sure you're okay. I pressed my palms to my face and held them there until the beat of my heart softened. Then I did something I'm not proud of and not ashamed of either. I opened Evan's text thread and scrolled all the way back to the night he'd brought Clara to meet me for dinner. In one of the photos I'd taken, because I am that mother who documents with her phone and apologizes later, she stood at my stove stirring sauce in a forest green scarf while my cat investigated her ankles. I closed my phone. I poured tea. I let it go cold. When Evan finally called, I tried to sound like the version of myself he can read without translating. "How's your heart?" he asked, because he is a son who remembers to ask that you're alive inside your body. "Did you get everything sorted at Aunt Dee's?" "Almost," I said. "I found a letter she wanted us to see. It mentions the bank, and it mentions someone with initials CB. He was quiet in that way he gets when he's measuring a beam or a person. "Do you want me to come over?" "Yes," I said, and then I said, "No. Tomorrow morning. Fresh. I don't want to do this at 9 at night with a kitchen light and a hungry stomach." "All right," he said. "I love you, Mom." He calls me Mom sometimes. He calls me Margaret when he wants to tease me about telling him to wear a hat. When I hung up, I looked out the window. The streetlights on my road make halos on wet pavement that look like they're trying to apologize for being late. I watched a pair of teenagers walk past, arguing about a band one of them insisted had saved his life. I watched a neighbor's dog tear across the leaf-sodden lawn chasing a squirrel who already knew it would win. I watched the slow, patient work of a small town at evening. I put the flash drive back into its bag. I slept badly. I'm excellent at sleeping badly. I rehearsed dozens of conversations that did not happen. I pictured hundreds of scarves, none of them green. And then morning came the way it always does, indifferent to last night's worry. Evan arrived at 9 with a bag of bakery muffins and the sort of careful smile you put on when you're not sure if you're visiting your mother or a grenade. He kissed the top of my head because I had my hands in the sink. He poured coffee. He said hello to the cat. He's the kind of man who does these things in that order. I set the folder on the table. I told him about the key. I told him what was in the bank box. I told him there were recordings. I told him I hadn't called the police because I didn't know what I had. I told him about CB and green scarf. He didn't interrupt. He has his father's patience and my sister's fixed stare. When I finished, he set his coffee down very gently and said, "Play them." We listened to Doris talk. We listened to men and women we didn't know pretend to be friends. We listened to the word bishop hover between our faces like a fly we weren't sure we were allowed to swat. When Clara's name arrived in the record, Evan flinched as if I dropped a pan. He closed his eyes. He opened them. He did not say her name out loud. "There are other Claras in the world," I offered, because sometimes the only thing to do with a cliff is to build a footbridge. She told us she left Bishop Group months ago, remember? This could be before. He nodded, but it was the kind of nod that accompanies the end of a lullaby and the beginning of a fever. "I need to talk to her," he said. "I think you need to talk to her here," I said. "Where I can—" I stopped. "Where I can what? Protect you? Translate? Hold your hand like a second grader crossing an icy parking lot?" He smiled, very small. "Where you can do what you've always done," he said. "Make people say the thing they're avoiding." Clara arrived an hour later. She must have driven fast because there's a stretch between her place and mine where the speed limit drops to a number that encourages cursing. She wore jeans, a gray sweater, and no scarf at all. She looked like someone who had recently discovered an aunt had left behind a letter and someone had pressed play on it, which is to say, she looked exactly like the rest of us, tired, braced, unwilling to be cast as a villain and unwilling to pretend she didn't recognize the plot line. Evan hugged her at the door. She held me as if I were a mutual friend. I made more coffee, and we sat at the table, and I told her what we had. I slid the folder toward her. I said her previous last name aloud like I was testing its flavor. She skimmed the copies with her jaw set the way you set a nail you're about to hammer. "I left Bishop Group 6 months ago," she said when she finished leafing through the pages. "I left because of this. Because of Charles Benton and his percent fees and his talent for standing near old people with pens. I told my broker I was done playing friendly with wolves. He told me I was ungrateful and naive. He told me women like me didn't last long without an umbrella. Then he stopped sending me leads and told colleagues I was difficult." She looked up at me, not at Evan. "I know how that recording sounds," she said. "I won't pretend I didn't sit at Doris's kitchen table in a green scarf and use a voice that didn't belong to me. I was good at it. We were trained to be good at it. Soft sentences, big promises, no details that could be argued with. I have not forgiven myself for that." "I also tried to fix it." "What do you mean?" Evan asked. His voice was level, but he curled his fingers around his coffee mug like it was heavy, and he didn't trust gravity. "I started keeping track of what Charles did," she said. "Screenshots of his emails, copies of riders changed after the meeting, the names of a notary who didn't always watch the signing. I knew I should have gone to the state, but I was terrified. I had rent. I had a mother with medical bills. I justified delays. That's how they all win, on the delays. Finally, I left. And then I met you. I told myself I would never let my personal life touch that past. And yet, I said too gently to be fair, here we are." She didn't cry. She wasn't a crier. She did that thing I've done a dozen times when confronted with a hard fact. She went still and checked the label on the fact and accepted it into the pantry where she stores unsugared truths. "Let me help," she said. "If those recordings show what I think, if Doris had documents in that box, then Charles has his hands on similar buckets all over town. He'll try to move fast now that Doris is gone. If there are riders, if there are transfer attempts, they'll be in motion this week." "I called the bank," I said. "They won't tell me anything without a lawyer." I sounded like a woman who did not want a lawyer. I wanted a time machine. We didn't have to decide anything right then, because the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, Detective Joel Ramsey stood on my porch holding a piece of mail he'd collected from Doris's forward that had accidentally landed in his box. Joel is not technically a detective. He's the kind of small-town police officer who has learned that some jobs require a badge and some require a drill. He's legally an officer and practically a de facto fixer. He said hello. He offered us the mail. He looked at our faces and set his jaw the way good men do when they realize their morning has new instructions. "Can I step in?" he asked, and we stepped back, and he sat at my table like a natural continuation of the fact of chairs. He knew Doris had died. He apologized sincerely and not excessively. He set his hat on the chair beside him like it, too, had manners. He told us he'd noticed unfamiliar cars near Doris's house at odd hours the past week. "Could be nothing," he said. "Could be people lost. Could be a dozen boring explanations. But your sister had called me twice over the winter when she thought she heard someone at the side door, and both times there were new footprints in the snow. I mention it because I'd rather you think me nosy than not think me at all." We showed him the folder. We told him about the recordings. He listened without writing anything down, which meant he was writing in his head the way good officers do, and the way good teachers always have. He asked if he could have copies. He told us we should call a lawyer. He told us he could hold the house on a watch list for extra patrol, though the town's idea of extra is often whatever the other shift forgot. When he reached the advertisement and saw Bishop Group, he grunted in a way that held a handful of history. "We've had complaints," he said. "Nothing that stuck. People sign things, they're embarrassed, they don't want to stand up in the bright light of a courtroom and admit that fear holds a pen. We've been trying to catch them between the signature and the transfer. It's like trying to catch a fish after it decides it doesn't like water. Clara used to work for them," I said, "because if I've learned anything, it's that you put all the facts on the table like cards, and you let people see their own hands." Joel looked at her. Not like she was a suspect, but like she was a person in need of a question she would be allowed to answer at her own speed. Clara didn't flinch. She told him the same thing she'd told us. He watched her like a man who has learned to tell the difference between someone remembering and someone inventing. He nodded. He asked for names. He knew some of them. He said, "Greta Pritchard?" And Clara said, "The notary who doesn't look up?" And he said, "Yes, her." We all looked at the last item in the folder, the list of checks to Bishop Group, and I felt the kind of fury that is not a shout, but a temperature. I wanted to walk over to a certain polished office and carry my principal's voice into their lobby and ask them to line up by height and conscience. "Here's what we're going to do," Joel said, and I realized that the thing men like him give us is not a gun or a car with lights, but a sentence that starts with "here's." We're going to make copies of everything and take them to the county attorney. We're going to tell the bank there's a potential fraud and block any non-court-ordered transfers. "Margaret, you're the executrix of the estate?" I nodded. "Then you are allowed to ask for a freeze for 72 hours while you locate heirs and confirm documents. People do it all the time for completely reasonable reasons. This one happens to be necessary. I'll make the call with you so the bank understands it's not a crank. Clara, if you have emails, you can forward them to me and to the attorney. Do not talk to your former broker. If he calls, let it go to voicemail. Save everything. Evan, do not sign anything anyone puts in front of you that even looks like it mentions trusts, riders, liens, or fees." "I promise you," Evan said, and I watched his face harden into a man who had a new job, and it had nothing to do with lawns. We did those things. We made copies. We signed a form. We called the bank, where Lila whispered, "We can absolutely place a note," the way kindness sometimes arrives as bureaucracy. We drove to the county attorney's office, where a young woman with a bun and a mug that said "I run on coffee and rules" took our folder and made words like triage and preliminary review sound like blankets. For 3 days, Clara sat at our kitchen table with her laptop and sent emails to Joel and to the attorney. She explained little industry rituals I had never imagined existed. "They'll call it a courtesy visit before they push a rescheduled signing," she said. "They'll say, 'We're just catching you up on documents.' They'll underplay deadlines. They'll overplay penalties. They'll bring cookies when pressed. They'll say the original signed forms were misplaced and need to be resigned. They'll use that word 'resign' as if it were 2 words, and you are giving up rather than signing again." She was fierce and specific. I watched her hands on the keyboard like you watch a woman working a loom. You know it looks old-fashioned, and it's actually making the fabric of the day. On the second afternoon of the freeze, a white SUV stopped in front of Doris's house and idled. Joel texted me from his cruiser. "I'm on my way." I sat in my car across the street with the window cracked because nobody decides to meddle in a family's affairs and then chooses to wait on their couch. I watched 2 people walk up to the front door with a folder and a small gift bag. The woman wore a scarf. It was green. The man held a pen in his right hand and a smile in his left. Joel pulled up behind them in a way that looked casual and was not. He got out. He said hello. He asked a few questions that sounded like, "What's your favorite coffee?" and were not. The man said his name was Charles. He said he was helping the late Miss Hale's estate with urgent tasks. He said he had a scheduled meeting with the executrix. Joel gestured at me across the street as if I were a neighbor with a hose. "That's the executrix," he said. "I suggest you wave." I did not wave. I got out of my car with all my school principal posture and none of my school principal patience. "You're not scheduled," I said, "and I'm busy." Charles's eyes went to the gift bag like maybe the gift bag could explain the misunderstanding. "We just have a few papers," he said. "If you sign today, you'll save yourself a lot of trouble later." He smiled in a way he probably practiced in a mirror, the way predators and politicians do. "You are not stepping onto that porch," Joel said, calm enough to pass a lie detector, "and you are not asking this woman to sign anything without counsel. We have a freeze in place and a county inquiry underway. Leave your card and your cookies if you like. Otherwise, leave." The woman in the green scarf touched the man's elbow the way a person touches a stovetop to check if a red light means what it means. "We should go," she said quietly. She wore sunglasses that made her look like someone hiding from a better version of herself. They left. I sat back down in my car and shook in the privacy of upholstery. That night, Evan and Clara came over for dinner, and we didn't talk about anything except things we could chew. After we cleared the plates, Clara asked if she could show me something. She opened her laptop and pulled up a folder labeled CB, Do Not Delete. She showed me emails forwarded to herself from an account that no longer existed at a company she'd left. She showed me attachments with riders that did not match the riders clients had signed. She showed me texts from a notary confirming she'd witnessed signature pages on days she was out of state with her daughter. It was a quilt of small wrongs stitched into something large. I watched it grow on the screen and wanted to burn it and display it and wrap my sister's house in it at the same time. I wish I could tell you the county attorney's office moved with the speed of a siren. It moved like government moves when it cares, briskly by its standards and like a glacier by yours. They asked for statements. We gave them. They asked for more copies. We made them. They asked for a list of other folks who might have been approached and consulted. Clara made a list. Joel made a longer one. I made phone calls to women I knew from church potlucks and parent-teacher nights and found out how many of them had endured a man with a cheerful voice and an important pen. Meanwhile, the question of the orchard sat at the corner of our table like a bowl of apples nobody remembered to eat. Hale Orchard Trust. Evan asked me what Doris meant. I told him a story he'd half forgotten, because the past is a book small towns keep rereading. Our father had carved 10 acres behind the Hale farmhouse into an orchard when we were kids. He'd said a family needed fruit and work, and a place you could see change slowly without resentment. Doris and I had picked there every September until boys and homework and cheap perfume became more interesting than apples. When our mother died, our father put the orchard in a trust because he didn't trust greed. He told us the land would stay in Hale hands as long as a Hale could tell you the name of the first tree planted, McIntosh, and point to the old tin pail he'd hammered flat and nailed to the fence as a joke near the back gate. After our father died, Doris took care of the orchard the way she took care of projects that didn't talk back, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing herself. "The orchard is yours by right," she had written. I hadn't thought he'd meant Evan, but of course she had. She always meant Evan when she said, "the boy in this family." So we went to the county clerk's office and filed something we didn't expect to file that Thursday, an update to trustee designation. It felt like paperwork and it felt like a birth. Evan signed with a hand that understood it was holding more than a pen. The clerk smiled at him the way women smile at men who have earned something honest. When we walked out into the daylight, he stood very still in the square and looked up at the courthouse clock and said, "I have to tell Doris, thank you. You." And then he knew he couldn't, and he pressed his lips together, and I rubbed his back, and nobody in that square pretended not to notice because pretending is not this town's strength. A week later, Joel called and said he needed us to come down to the station. "We have enough to bring Charles in for questioning," he said. "We want you there because the county attorney thinks hearing his own voice read back to him might loosen other tongues." We also located something interesting in the title company records, a quick claim deed filed on Doris's parcel number 2 days after her obituary ran. It didn't complete. We froze it in time. He knows he's been caught mid-move. I wore my good coat. Evan wore his serviceable jacket that makes him look like a man who knows where the extension cords live. Clara wore a navy dress and a face so composed it might have been borrowed. We sat in a small room with a glass window where somebody had once taped a cartoon that said, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." The county attorney, whose bun was looser and whose mug now said, "This is prosecutor fuel," laid out papers. Joel stood to one side like a hinge. They brought Charles in without handcuffs and with that same practiced smile. If I had met him at a charity brunch, I would have said he looked like a person you could trust to pour coffee. That's why we are wrong so often. He sat. He looked at Clara. He said, "I wondered when you would grow the spine you keep misplacing." Clara did not look away. The county attorney started with small things: your name, your title, your company. The attorney read a rider aloud. She asked about a notary's stamp. She pressed play on an audio file, the one where he called my sister dear and said he could make probate disappear like a parlor trick. He didn't flinch. They rarely do at the beginning. The human face learns to shrug before it learns to blush. Then she offered him a choice. Not a legal one, a human one. The kind principals make when they want a confession in the presence of a lunch tray. "We have enough to bring charges," she said. "We can do this with you cooperating or without. There are other families. This didn't start with Miss Hale. It won't end with her." You can start telling the truth and save yourself some trouble. Or you can sit here practicing your little smile until a judge sees how much you like it." He took a breath to toss a charming sentence, and then he saw something in Clara's face, maybe the absence of fear, which is a kind of mirror, and he let the breath out heavier. "You're going to paint me like a monster," he said. "It's a business." People want cash. We provide options. We skirt the slow parts. "They're called laws," the county attorney said, not unkindly. "We don't skirt those." "You do," he said. "All of you do. You skirt them when it benefits you." I leaned forward. "I taught 7th graders for 9 years, Mr. Benton," I said. "Do not try their argument on me. It's beneath the intelligence of children." He looked at me properly for the first time, and his eyes did that tiny focus that means the person you are speaking to has realized you are not furniture. Then he started talking, not in a neat confession with bullet points. He told a story in that wandering way people do when they want you to conclude the least harmful thing about them. He spoke of clients who were lonely and grateful. He spoke of paperwork he didn't draft, but hustled. He named the notary. He named a second notary. He named 3 consultants who were paid by the percent. He named his former broker, who called himself a deal architect, as if deals needed buildings and buildings required priests. He admitted to altering language in 2 writers for clarity. He admitted to scheduling a signing at a hospital bedside because it was convenient for the client. He admitted he had planned to visit my sister's house after her death with a condolence kit that included cookies, a tissue box, and a compassionate reminder about the work we'd begun. He asked for coffee. He drank it with a hand that didn't shake. He did not ask for a lawyer until he realized we were going to keep asking small questions until a big truth stood there without juice. In the days that followed, other families came forward. A retired mail carrier who'd been promised his daughter would never have to fuss with county stamps if he signed. A widow who'd agreed to streamline and woke up to learn the streamline had taken her husband's tool shed with it. A man my age whose mother had temporarily transferred title a week before her stroke. They came with their riders. They came with their embarrassment like coats they didn't want to carry inside. They came because someone had asked them in a voice that made more space than shame. There were arrests. There will be court dates. There will be depositions and dull hours in windowless rooms and sentences read into the air that cannot contain them. I will not pretend the world fixed itself because we slid a letter out from under a floorboard. Evil is not a mole you whack with one good swing. But there is satisfaction in watching a man who used pens as levers be handed a stack of papers he does not want to sign. Through it all, in that small and enormous life called our own, Evan and Clara moved around each other like people crossing a river on stones. He adored her. She had lied to him by omission. He trusted her. She had worked for people whose signatures made my skin crawl. He told me he didn't know how to forgive and trust at the same time. I told him those 2 things are not synonyms. They are cousins who sometimes visit together and sometimes pretend they don't know each other. One evening, a month after the station room and the coffee and the names, Clara asked if she could come by just to speak to me alone. Evan texted ahead. "She doesn't want me there." "She says you'll tell her the truth in English." He added a heart that felt necessary. She came in and held a grocery bag like an offering. She'd brought lemons and flour and butter and insisted on making a lemon loaf at my counter because she said her hands needed work to make her mouth behave. We measured and stirred, and she told me the rest. She told me about a time 2 years earlier when she'd suggested to her broker they stop targeting homeowners listed in hospice obituaries, and he'd called her soft. She told me about a meeting when Charles had told her she looked too nice while you do the thing, and she had gone home and washed her face like she was trying to remove a mask. She told me the day she left Bishop Group, she'd sat in her car for 2 hours and tried to decide whether to blow everything up on social media or disappear quietly. She chose quiet. She regretted it. She told me she'd met Evan at a yard sale when they reached for the same stained glass window, and she'd felt something like forgiveness and something like weather. She told me she had asked him what his mother was like, and he'd said, "She's someone who thinks truth and kindness can live in the same house." and she had wondered if that house would allow her in. "Do you love my son?" I asked. Because you're allowed to ask this direct question if you've watched a person watch a man you made. "Yes," she said, as if she'd been waiting for that one question. "I love him more than it is useful to say. I also understand if he needs time. He does," I said. "But time is not a punishment. It's a room you sit in while the furniture arrives." She smiled and shook her head. "You talk like a principal," she said. "I mean that as a compliment and a small warning." We ate the lemon loaf hot enough to scorch our tongues. The world did not correct itself while we chewed, but something in my chest settled. Because the thing I'd feared most, having to choose between my son's heart and my sister's honor, moved into the past tense. They weren't opposite ends of a rope. They were two things I could hold at once, like sorrow and soup. Spring came early that year, because sometimes Vermont remembers mercy. Evan spent weekends at the orchard, pruning branches and muttering to trees like they'd done him wrong and deserved another chance. He took off his jacket and set it on fence posts the way men set a problem down so their hands are free. He called me over one Saturday with a look of triumph. He'd found the old tin pail our father had hammered flat. He'd found a line of stones my father had set to mark the first row. He'd found the work of men he'd loved, and he was adding his own. He brought Clara and showed her which tree was oldest and which was the one kids had hidden behind to kiss when they were 13 and savages. I spent more days than I should admit sitting on the edge of the porch at Doris's house while Joel supervised a locksmith changing the side door lock and looked pleased to have a task where the outcome was immediate. At some point, he handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You handled this like a professional." And I said, "I was a professional." And he said, "I know." And we looked at the trees and decided weather would be good for sap. We had to sell some of Doris's things. We kept others. I kept the beadboard piano bench because a squeak can be a ledger of memory. We boxed fabric and notions for the women at church who sew for preemies and funerals. We found a half-finished quilt that had squares labeled with names of women from the Hale line back to 1898. If you want to feel like time is a table you get to sit at, find a square of navy cotton with your grandmother's maiden name hand-stitched in it by your sister who died in March. We took the quilt to Regina at the library to display in the community case near the local history shelf. Not everyone will stop to look, but the right people will. We decided to create something useful with what remained of the money my sister had stubbornly kept from wolves. Evan said the orchard would host a Saturday reading table once a month to teach people how to read contracts. Clara offered to stand there with coffee and explain words like irrevocable and assigns without flinching. Joel said he would bring a friend who could explain in plain terms what happens when you sign away a right you didn't realize you could keep. We called it Doris's Table because if you want people to show up, you give them a woman's name and baked goods. On the day of the first table, we set up folding chairs near the back gate, not far from where the tin pail hangs. We made a poster with simple lettering. Ask any question. No fees, no push, no judgment. People came. They brought writers. They brought letters. They brought their late father's shoebox of receipts. They brought embarrassment and anger and a hunger to have somebody say, "You're not dumb. You were rushed." We sat them down and poured coffee and answered each question like it was the first time we'd heard it. Joel wore his badge under his flannel and showed it only when he needed to. Clara wore no scarf. Evan wore sunscreen and cut apples for little kids who were bored after 20 minutes. I watched from the folding chair closest to the tin pail and felt, for the first time in weeks, that the scale in my heart had decided on a balance. There's more. There always is. The case against Bishop Group moved with the slow firmness of a maple tapping. There were pleas, there were sentences, there were fines that will never be enough, and some days when I believe prison is just a building, we put people in because we don't know what else to do with certain kinds of meanness. Charles went away for a while, not long enough to please anyone, long enough to make the kind of impression time makes on men who think time is theirs to spend. The broker lost his license for a period that sounded like a stern conversation, but felt like a slap. The notary will not sign for anyone again who isn't her child, as part of a deal with an office that likes paper more than people. Some of the families won back parts of what they'd lost. Some didn't. This is not a story where everything returns to the shelf it stood on before the earthquake. This is a story where you learn which shelves matter and which you build again. There were also hours, quiet, private ones, in which I mourned my sister without paperwork and pen. I went into her sewing room and touched the small surfaces of her life. The thimble with a nick that matched her left hand. The jar of buttons sorted by color like prayers sorted by hope. The chalk that left temporary marks that always washed out. Something you cannot say for some hurts. I sat on her floor where we had lifted that board and I said aloud, "You did good, Dory." And allow me to tell you that in a sister's heart, the word good can be a cathedral. Evan and Clara, for their part, learned the shape of each other again. They went to counseling because they are the kind of grown-ups who would prefer to build a bridge with an expert rather than throw rocks across a river and guess. They walked the orchard every Sunday and argued in gentle voices about gutters and compost, and whether the old shed should be saved or surrendered to time. They came over to my house and filled my dishwasher and left their shoes by the door, like weary children and not like guests. They reminded me that redemption is not a single act, it is a daily habit. The orchard bore well that fall. We laid a picnic table under the Macintosh and invited the neighbors for an afternoon that smelled like cinnamon and grass. Regina from the library stopped by with flyers for our next reading table and a pie that might have saved 10 marriages. Joel came with his daughter and a Frisbee. Lila from the bank came to say the word freeze in a sentence that made us all laugh. A new couple who had just moved into Doris's house, a nurse and a teacher with arms built for lifting other people's stories, carried over a plate of brownies and told me they'd discovered that the south window latch sticks and also that the porch light switch requires sweet talk. "We love it," they said. "And you know what? You cannot buy that word when it is earned." Towards sunset, when the light decides to be sentimental and everyone forgives it, Evan climbed onto the picnic bench and cleared his throat like the kid who always hated group projects and suddenly decided to volunteer. "I don't like speeches," he said, which is exactly what people who make good ones say before they begin. "I just want to thank everyone who helped us climb out of something we didn't fall into alone." He looked at me. "Mom," he said, "because that is my name when it matters. Thank you for opening that letter. Thank you for listening to what it asked. Thank you for reminding me that protecting the people you love doesn't always look polite." I thought of admonishing him for standing on furniture. I thought of asking him to come down before he fell and we had a different kind of story to tell. Instead, I nodded at him and stilled my hands in my lap because sometimes the right discipline is to allow joy to finish its sentence. After everyone left and the plates had been taken inside and the ants had claimed what was theirs, I stood under the old tree and watched the last light drift out of the orchard like breath leaving a sleeping child. I remembered something my father had told me when I was 14 and furious with a friend who had told a half-truth that left a whole mess. He'd said, "Justice doesn't always arrive with a gavel. Sometimes it comes wearing work gloves and carrying a broom." At the time, I'd rolled my eyes the way 14-year-olds do when metaphors require chores. Now I understood he'd been talking about nights like this, about days spent calling banks and walking slow in the county building and letting your son test the strength of your voice and your love in the same hour. It would be clean to end here. It would be tidy to set the story down at the moment when all people are well lit and desserts are finished. But stories, especially the ones we live, prefer rough edges. So here is one. A month after the picnic, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a hallway, a hand, a pen, a page. No faces. A single sentence was scrawled across the back. "We know what you did," it said, which is the kind of sentence men like Charles prefer to write because it hides the subject. I put the photo on my table. I looked at it. I made tea. I considered fear. I don't like it. I prefer respect. I prefer weather. I prefer the way a tree does not apologize. I took the photo to Joel. He looked at it and ran his thumb along the edge and said, "We'll add it to the file." And then he looked at me as if I had dropped a brick on my foot and insisted I was fine. "Do I need to put a cruiser in your driveway for a week?" he asked. "No," I said. "I need you to show me how to work the motion sensor light on Doris's side porch because it always stays on and keeps the raccoons awake." He smiled. "People like Joel appreciate a woman who refuses to audition for panic." "All right," he said, "but if you change your mind about the cruiser, you call me at any hour." I went home and baked banana bread with coconut because that was the thing I could manage without making a list. Then I sat in the sewing room and lifted the floorboard again. I had no expectation of more letters. I had no desire for more mysteries. I simply wanted to remind myself that secrets do not refuse to be found. Under the board, I slid a half sheet of paper in my own handwriting, dated and folded twice. It said, in case anyone ever needed it, "If you find this and need permission to do the right thing, you have it. M.H." That winter, the orchard looked like a page that had been erased and left clean. Snow covered all the finger smudges. Birds wrote small, sharp notes on the margins. Evan plowed the drive with his truck and waved at nobody. Clara set out suet near the kitchen window because she liked to watch small creatures eat like kings. I learned how to make stew for two when I had cooked for one for too long. We began to plan, not in big proclamations, but in grocery lists and email subject lines. The past was not undone. The future was not living in a catalog. But the present felt like something you could lift with a hand you had built yourself. In the spring, we planted 3 new saplings at the end of the 3rd row. We gave them names we wrote on a scrap of a brown paper bag, and tucked into mason jar lids we hammered onto stakes near their roots. One we named Doris, plainly. One we named Orchard, because sometimes you say the thing you mean even when it's obvious. One we named Gavel, because my son has a sense of humor, and because we had found our version of judgment, not loud and not cruel, but firm and firming. When the wind moved through the leaves and made that sound that makes your throat feel honest, I imagined somewhere my sister scolding me for sentiment. I imagined our father telling me I'd finally learned something he meant to teach. I imagined my son's children one day throwing apples at that tin pail and laughing when it rang. The last time I went to the bank during all of it, Lila asked me if I wanted a safe deposit box of my own, and I said no. I've developed an allergy. The last time I saw Charles was in the courthouse hallway, as he shuffled past in an ill-fitting suit beside a lawyer who had the face of a man who wished he had studied accounting instead. He didn't look at me. That was merciful. Some men attempt a last smile, and it is worse than the first. The last time I spoke to the county attorney, she told me she was applying for a grant to train volunteers to help seniors read contracts. "People will trust you before they trust us," she said. "That annoys me, and I respect it." She asked if I would consider standing up at a breakfast in the spring to speak for 3 minutes about the letter under the floorboard. 3 minutes? I said. "I am 68 years old and an expert in bell schedules. I can make water ring a bell." She laughed. She promised coffee. I agreed. I told her I would say this, and maybe it's what I mean to say now to anyone who asks how to hold a family together when the world is as careless as weather. The quietest justice is often the strongest kind. It's the kind you practice in kitchens and office cubicles and parking lots outside county buildings. It's the kind that doesn't need a gavel to matter. It is built out of letters you choose to open, words you decide to say, questions you dare to ask even when you're afraid the answer will break your heart. It is a broom and a pair of work gloves and a habit of standing still until someone stops trying to scare you into moving. On the day we hung the small wooden sign at the edge of the orchard that said, "Hail Orchard, Estates, 1969, Stewards, Evan and Clara," a breeze swung the chain and made the sign clack softly against the post. I held the bottom of it steady until the screws tightened. Evan leveled the bracket with an eye he trusts more than tools. Clara stepped back and tilted her head to make sure it looked like something she would want to show to a stranger who got lost and ended up in our lane. We were 3 bodies doing one sensible task. If you'd driven by and seen us, you would have not known the words scarf or rider or freeze or Charles. You would have seen 2 hands and another on a sign and imagined any ordinary day. That's the point, I suppose. After you do all the work, after the letters and the meetings and the kitchen tables, what you hope to arrive at is an ordinary day. You hope the extraordinary part is gone. You hope nothing happens that requires a story. You hope you can go inside and wipe your shoes and eat a bowl of soup and call your son and tell him to bring home milk, and he says he already has, and you say good because you forgot. You hope you can take a breath and hold it and feel how your life fits inside your rib cage, not too loose and not too tight, and say, this is right, and believe yourself. You hope the floorboards stay where they are supposed to until someone who needs them again. If they do need them, if someone you love finds themselves holding a letter addressed in the careful hand of someone gone, tell them they're allowed to open it. Tell them to bring tea. Tell them to sit at the kitchen table and breathe. Tell them that if a sentence in that letter warns them not to sign a paper, they should honor that sentence like a promise. Tell them that if a person shows up with a green scarf and a folder, they should go find a friend with a badge and a neighbor with a drill and a woman with a principal's voice. Tell them that love is not a reason to be quiet and truth is not a weapon to be cruel. Tell them they can keep a family together by telling the truth to it. Tell them that a gavel is nice if you have one, but a broom and a backbone will do. And tell yourself that if you ever open a floorboard and find a message that asks you to be brave, you do not need permission. You already have it. I wrote it down in ink and slid it under wood. Do the right thing.